When we talk about pasture herbicides and reseeding, we have got to consider something that is known as the replant interval. So a good definition for replant interval is that amount of time you have to wait after spraying a herbicide before you can safely seed the desired forage or the desired crop. Now, I have done a little digging and picked out, or at least a few examples here of some replant intervals. 2,4-D, which is a broadleaf herbicide, one of the most common, you will find you need to wait a minimum of 3 months for seeding alfalfa or forage grasses. Now, what this means when you have a replant interval specified for a herbicide that's sprayed over the top, that's intended to kill weeds by getting on their leaves, is that that same herbicide will have soil activity. So you look at another broadleaf killer, Banvel, or the common name is dicamba, replant alfalfa or forage grasses the next fall. Roundup, there is no waiting on the label, but many will wait a couple of weeks to do so to let the weeds affected die down. Crossbow, which is triclopyr plus 2,4-D, is a 3-week waiting interval. Grazon Next, again, one of the most popular of what I would say the new generation of broadleaf killers, has only 15 days to wait to replant cool season grasses and 4 months for legumes. And this has just been released on a supplemental label. And this is a visual way to take a look at the replant interval for legumes following Grazon Next. Our Kentucky label is here. The 2 pints right here. So you can, depending on the rate, here's the way this works. So if you if you spray in April, you can plant legumes in September. If you spray in May, you can plant them in October. If you spray in June, you can't do it until November. So practically speaking, if we spray Grazon Next in a pasture during the growing season, and a lot of times it's going to be this May, June, July period, then we're not going to seed clover until we get into the next, either frost seeding it the next February or drilling it into fields in March or April. I think there's replant confusion. Intervals are not consistent. For example, you can find a 3-month waiting interval for 2,4-D, and you can find waiting intervals for Banvel that say the fall after you apply. But Weedmaster, which is Banvel plus 2,4-D, is 4 months. So I think it's confusing. There's also hedging on labels. You will see things like this is the waiting period or until a successful bioassay has been completed, which means that you've taken soil and you've tried to germinate your forage of choice in it to see if it is in fact okay. Intervals are sometimes overestimates of the actual sensitive time because a company or a reformulator of a herbicide may want to just be conservative. Environmental conditions, rainfall especially, will make a difference. For example, application of 2,4-D, if you've had significant rain events that have happened after that, then certainly you would expect the replant interval to be as stated or even less than the stated period. I want to talk about a residual problem that we have with Grazon Next. Grazon Next is a compound named aminopyrrolide plus 2,4-D, and it is potentially big problems in compost and manure. So let's take a look at this graphic and what it means. So if we're going to spray rangeland or pasture or hay fields or CRP land with Grazon Next, and we have pasture or hay, we feed it to livestock, manure and hay or bedding, and if you compost that, the only place you can go with that compost or manure is back on rangeland or pasture land or wheat. If you go, and the mistake that has been made is taking bedding or compost or manure from animals that have grazed uh, Grazon or forage treated with Grazon next, and then you try to grow potatoes, lettuce, beans, or tomatoes in that compost or fertilize with the manure, it will kill them. So you will not to you want to be very careful if you're with the manure or the compost or the hay or the bedding that comes from uh, pastures that have, or hay fields that have been sprayed with aminopyrrolid. So bottom line, aminopyrrolid is very persistent in hay, manure, and bedding, and there are some very sensitive plants. Another point or another decision point, if you're talking about herbicides and weeds, is should I spray or not? And so here are three questions that you can ask yourself. The first thing is the weed nutritious, like Johnson grass or crabgrass? And this would be an argument with those two species that it would not be advantageous to spray when you can graze or manage them so that they can be an asset. Both can be made into pretty decent hay and both make excellent pasture if it's well managed. The next bullet is a little harder to determine because if you know the weed is causing economic damage, then in other words, the cost of the damage is more than the cost of the product plus application plus your time, then it's a pretty simple issue. And I'll hold up the example of ironweed because it is a problem weed that reduces available forage significantly. And I will also say, though, that it's one of the few weeds that we have that kind of information on. So a little later in this lecture, I'll give you some guidelines about when to spray or when not to spray with using this type of a concept. So the economic damage, if you know the damage and you can compare it to the cost, then that makes that easy, but that number is not easy to come up with. And the third bullet on the slide is, what about the clover? And we've talked about that before. Don't forget the 25% rule. Will the product that you need to use to kill the weed, will it kill the clover? And sometimes when you've got woody species that are very difficult to kill, then you're going to be moving past, you're not going to be able to use Proclova, probably. You're going to have to use something that will get the clover, so that you've got to factor that loss into your decision to spray. So I told you we would talk about, is there a threshold or how to know whether we should use some chemical weed control. And here's the principle. Weeds must displace enough forage to account for the spraying, the cost of spraying, the cost of the material, and the loss of clover. Here's a broad strategy that you can use to make a herbicide application or a weed control plan, not a herbicide application plan, a weed control plan for a farm. If you've got annuals, then just manage the forage to suppress them. Annuals are opportunistic. They come where there isn't forage already. So that this is a classic place in almost every instance to try to thicken up what you have. That's the way to go. If you've got invasive species like honeysuckle or others, Canada thistle, for example, then spray them. You just need that to control them. Now, you may choose to spot spray and do other things that limit the damage that the broadleaf herbicide may cause to your clover, but you need to spray. If you know you've got an economic problem, economically problematic weed like ironweed, then spray to control ironweed. For other perennials, we've established, or the weed control group at UK has established, that a 20% threshold, in other words, 20% of the field being covered in weeds, is approaching that point where the cost of killing the weed the herbicide costs is less than the value of the forage that would have been grown on 1/5 of that field. So these would be a broad strategy, and it would be well worth your time to internalize, to know this broad strategy for developing a weed control plan on a farm. And one of the next points I want to make has to do with this publication, AGR 207, called Broadleaf Weeds of Kentucky Pastures. On the front, it's pictures. On the back is a table of weeds, timing, and herbicide choice. But I want to make the point, and the title says it, that with weeds, timing is everything. This is the back page of AGR 207. And you can see the weed species is listed on the left, the life cycle, annual, biennial, perennial, preferred time for herbicide treatment, and then the herbicide choices. In this table, Grazon Next is listed in old versions of this publication. That would be the Forefront R+P. So let's take a look at just a few examples of how we might use this. Let's look at, chicory. If you know you've got a chicory problem in a field, and most of the time you know that because it's up and blooming in the summertime, and it's a perennial, then February and March is the time to use products, or August and November. And since you can tell anything with a G in it is going to give you good control, you've got many options for control. AGR 207 also has a category here, or a rating category, for mowing alone. And when you've got, I'm trying to think, there it is at the very bottom. When you've got mowing, R means timely mowing reduces top growth and seed production. S is suppression of top growth, or X, not very effective. And in the case of chicory, it's R, so timely mowing reduces top growth and seed production. You can take a look at others like poison hemlock. We've got both a fall and a spring window. Broadleaf plantain or buckhorn plantain, again, a fall or spring window. The thistles, you can see those there as well. So this is the way you use AGR 207. And the point is that, not every weed can be killed 12 months out of the year. There are better and worse times, and there are products that are better and worse. And the more blue options you have, the more options you have for killing those weeds. So here's a close-up showing buttercup, which is a real problem for our pastures in the spring, but you've got to be on it early February and March. Horse nettle, on the other hand, is more of a summer weed, and you're going to need an ironweed down here, and those are summertime applications, and you're going to find that you have fewer options that are going to kill those weeds. Another point is that the fall herbicide application window is often overlooked. Weeds do need to be actively growing when you spray, but this was a simple spray of 2,4-D down one side of this horse pasture on the Main Chance farm that UK owns and operates. Looking to the left, you can see that the good broadleaf weed control, and those broadleafs consisted of dandelions and purple dead nettle, and quite a bit of it. And you can see very little purple dead nettle and no dandelions that I can see in the field to the left. So, these are going to, and the positive thing is that the grass has a better chance to grow. These weeds are not by themselves bad. In fact, I'd say they are probably pretty good in terms of nutrition, but they don't give you any hoof support. And when you are able to take them out, then you're able then to stimulate the grass to fill in these areas if it's a sod-forming grass, or you can plant more into that if you have a replant window that's working with you, or you can add clover, because you can spray in the fall, add clover in the spring, and improve the pasture. But don't overlook that fall window. It can be quite good for many herbicides and weed combinations. Of course, I want to come back to this pasture plant, and you'll recognize that as Johnson grass in a red clover field, and it's fully headed out. Now, Johnson grass fully headed out is probably one of the hardest things in the world to kill by herbicide, and this picture and this circumstance reminds me to tell you that, but it also reminds me to tell you that This is a red clover grass field that this Johnson grass is growing in. This is the classic quandary or classic dilemma of how do I kill the Johnson grass and deal with my clover? Well, you can't. The only way you can do that is to use that rope wick sprayer and then come in here because you've got a clear height differential and wick something like Roundup onto this Johnson grass and let it be translocated. And you're probably going to have to do it more than once. And if this was your field and you wanted to develop a strategy for it, you would cut that off for hay and let it regrow and be young and tender to kill the Johnson grass. Now, a side note with Johnson grass in particular, Johnson grass is almost never a problem in grazed pasture because it's palatable and it will not persist well, or it certainly will not be very competitive in a grazed pasture. And if you wonder about that, just drive around and see if you see much Johnson grass in a pasture field. You won't. I want to remind you of this too. Johnson grass is a sorghum, and all sorghums have cyanide potential, not a practical concern in summer pastures because there's a dilution effect with everything else there that animals are eating, and animals keep it short. So they're getting, there's not as much Johnson grass in terms of the area covered, and the Johnson grass that is there is in short supply. They're just not going to be grazing very much of it. It's not a practical problem in hay or baleage or silage because the cyanide dissipates as it dries a little bit, and it's actually metabolized in the ensiling process. The problem time, you will remember, is frosted Johnson grass or drought-stressed Johnson grass or a field that for whatever reason has been highly nitrogen fertilized. So these are the problems when Johnson grass can be problematic in terms of cyanide potential for grazing livestock. So let's summarize this lecture on weed control in forages. First of all, you're going to want to use all of your available methods, the biological, especially the cultural, and the chemical if you need to, and thickening up the stand is the very best place to start. You're going to want to, in this decision-making process, try to figure out the economic damage of the weed. And remember, I told you that in a weed like ironweed, that's fairly easy. We know some of those thresholds. For other perennial weeds, 20% of the pasture being covered is the threshold that we use. For annuals, we say live with them and thicken up the stand and deal with it by strengthening the stand that they're in. Watch the waiting intervals for the product you're using for hay and grazing and slaughter, and realize that lactating dairy cows are some of the most sensitive in terms of or at least the most limited in terms of herbicide choices and waiting periods for grazing or haying those pastures. Don't forget about the clover dilemma and herbicide use and that 25% rule. And a very, very key point that it is that if you have the need to use a herbicide, you also have the need to put something back in those places where the weed was. So a herbicide program needs a replant program. And be mindful of replant intervals if you're going to develop a herbicide program and then replant later on. So this brings me to the conclusion of this weed control and forage lecture. Until next time, I'll see you then.